So, what is creatine and how do you dose it? So, this gets into the article loading and maintenance.
That's a great question. So yeah, creatine is a supplement you can purchase. It's very, very cheap. It's just a white powder. It's typically sold as creatine monohydrate, although are a bunch of different types of creatine that are out there, which I'll discuss why those probably aren't worth getting. But yeah, creatine it's basically a compound that is found in meats, and it is a combination of three different amino acids, and it is stored in muscle, and it is used as an energy substrate for contraction. So if you go back to your physiology classes, you might remember there's different energy systems. There's the ATP-CP system, which powers the first 10 seconds of all-out effort. There's
Is that
aerobic
the
and
creatine
anaerobic.
phosphate?
Creatine phosphate, yes, right?
Okay.
So we cleave off the phosphate. We use that for energy. The byproduct is creatinine, and we recycle creatine constantly. And we actually store that in muscle. So you would supplement with creatine specifically for the purpose of fueling high intensity contractions. And knowing that it is actually stored in muscle, we have intramuscular creatine stores, right? These tend to be slightly higher in meat eaters because, like I said, this is present in animal products primarily, and not so much in dairy or eggs. So you even see it being higher in omnivores than lacto-vegetarians. Tangentially, some research has shown that vegetarians benefit more from supplementing with creatine than meat eaters, which makes sense when you think about it. And it is very challenging to get to maximal muscle creatine stores without supplementing. One of the reasons is that when you cook meats, it degrades the creatine content. It turns it into creatinine, which is the byproduct. So unless you're eating a lot of, steak tartare, a whole lot of rare steaks, or you're on, I'm sure Liver King has no problem getting his creatine high. Let's put it that way. If you're consuming a lot of sashimi, maybe. But for the most part, while there are slightly higher values for meat eaters versus omnivores, they're not maxed out. And when you look at some of the fundamental research on creatine, you can see that you can get a pretty solid bump in your muscle creatine stores from taking creatine. And this is typically done by loading, or if you look at, a creatine monohydrate tub from your supplement supplier, they'll tell you to take 5 doses of 5 grams per day for the better part of a week, so 20 to 25 grams per day for 5 to 7 days. And at that point, you'll have saturated muscle creatine stores, and then you're on your way to Gainesville. And typically what will occur from that loading period is you'll be up in body weight by about 1% to 2%. And that is primarily from the increased muscle creatine and the associated water that is bound to creatine, much like glycogen has bound water to it. And that's good. That's good weight. You look more muscular. It's intracellular, weight, and it is creatine supplementation in multiple meta-analyses and many RCTs that have been done over the last 30 years now, been shown to enhance strength, power, repeated sprint performance, and also lean body mass gains. So it is, like you said, and accurately characterized, probably the most well-studied supplement for resistance training performance. There is probably more research on caffeine, but a lot of that has been done in other realms. And importantly, there's very few longitudinal trials looking at the effect of chronic caffeine supplementation on strength or hypertrophy, but there are a lot of them on creatine. Most of the caffeine trials are on, hey, if I take caffeine right now and go work out, what happens to that workout? And while we have that in creatine as well, a large body of research is what happens if I take creatine for 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 24 weeks, even some trials that are coming up on multiple years, as there's more and more interest in creatine because it has health effects. Creatine is not just stored in muscle, it's also stored in other tissues, importantly, the brain. And there's neurological benefits to taking creatine for certain neurological disorders, as well as for reducing the severity of concussions or TBIs, traumatic brain injuries, and increasing the rate of recovery from them. So it has a neuroprotective effect, which has been studied, and now there's a lot more money behind creatine. So it's being seen very differently today than it was, say, in the 90s, when Mark McGuire had to go in front of, or baseball was getting under the lens for the doping violations, and some of the high profile baseball players like Jose Canseco, Mark McGwire, Barry Bonds. Mark McGwire famously said, "Hey, I'm not taking steroids. I'm just taking andro and creatine." And all of a sudden, creatine got seen as some type of steroid, right? So questions on whether I should cycle it. Is it dangerous? Is it going to make me have these secondary sexual characteristics of taking androgenic anabolic steroids? No. If you're eating, chicken, you're taking creatine to some degree. So anyway, bit of a tangent, but we're now in 2023 understanding that creatine has beneficial effects as a clinical supplement, and can be used outside of just the lifting community. But yeah, creatine is the most well-studied supplement. And despite all this research and despite all this massive body of data, it has a small effect on strength and hypertrophy. So it is still a supplement, which means it is supplemental. Like if you submitted a supplemental tax form to the IRS and not your main tax form, they would probably come after you. So that's the same way you should view supplements in a dietary sense. So, yep.
One thing I need to point out, because there was a lot of meat talk in there, is that I eat meat, but creatine is vegan. So
yeah, that's actually a really good point. Yes, creatine is lab created. If you are a vegan and you buy creatine, you're not consuming an animal product, which is a really good point.
And then the last thing that I wanted to clarify about creatine is I take 5 grams per day. I don't know, maybe I missed it, but what dose do you take and how do you take it?
Yeah, generally, I take personally 5 grams on workout days. But if you wanted to get it down to like what's an appropriate dose, somewhere between like 0.03 to 0.04 grams per kilogram, which for most people comes out to being like 2 to 6 grams per day. And it is a chronic supplement. So it's not something that has an acute effect when you take it. The goal is to take it until you actually get to maximal saturated muscle creatine stores. And going back to how I mentioned, most of the time you'll see supplement companies and even some of the sports science papers recommend this loading phase that will get you topped out as fast as possible. Okay, great. It takes 5 days. But there's also data showing just taking 5 grams a day can get you topped out or at a similar level to been shown in prior research from loading within 2 weeks. So you're saving 10 days at best if you just take 5 grams a day. And importantly, there are very few side effects to creatine. The ones that are most frequently reported are gastrointestinal distress. And notably, they are higher when you take larger doses. So the likelihood of experiencing gastrointestinal distress is multiple factors higher in terms of probability when you're loading versus not. And just as an example, when you think about the necessity of loading or the benefit of getting muscle creatine stores saturated a few days earlier, I haven't stopped taking creatine since 2004. This is, like I said, it's in meat, it's in chicken. It's not something that needs. There's no long-term issues. It's a food essentially. It's a food nutrient component that has been isolated. It's not a hormone or anything like that. So whether or not I got slightly better gains for 10 days or 6 days or something like that back in 2004 means literally nothing today. But it does cost, multiple times as much to take 25 grams a day for a week rather than taking 5 grams a day. So it is really inefficient from a cost perspective. It's more likely to produce gastrointestinal distress, and probably any performance gain you would get from having slightly higher muscle creatine stores might be nullified by the gastrointestinal discomfort if you do experience it. So I think the best recommendation is not to load and just take 5 grams a day or 5 grams on workout days until you stop wanting to take creatine, which for me has not happened yet. It's been 19 years. So, yeah.